The pen felt heavier than it should have as I held it above the documents spread across my mahogany desk. Behind me, I could hear Rebecca's sharp intake of breath, her manicured nails tapping against her designer purse with nervous energy. She thought she was witnessing my downfall, watching me sign away everything I had built over the past 40 years. What she didn't realize was that I had orchestrated every single detail of this moment, down to the exact placement of each paper on my desk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in my corner office overlooking the Portland skyline. At 68, I had grown accustomed to the rhythm of running Harrison and Associates, the public relations firm I had built from nothing after my divorce 30 years ago. The company had become my second child, nurtured with the same fierce dedication I had once reserved for my son David before he chose a life that prioritized his wife's opinions over family loyalty. Rebecca had arrived precisely at 9:30, accompanied by her lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who kept glancing at his phone as if this meeting was beneath his attention. My daughter-in-law wore her usual armor of expensive clothing and practiced smile, the one she had perfected during her 5-year marriage to my son. She believed that smile gave her power over people, made them underestimate her calculating nature. She was partially right about the underestimation, but completely wrong about who was doing the calculating. David sat beside his wife, his posture uncomfortable and his eyes avoiding mine. My 35-year-old son had once been my closest confidant, sharing my passion for building something meaningful from the ground up. He had worked summers at the agency during college, learning every aspect of the business from client relations to crisis management. Those had been our golden years together, before Rebecca convinced him that working for his mother was somehow beneath his potential. The documents before me represented what Rebecca believed was her master stroke. After months of subtle manipulation and careful legal maneuvering, she had convinced David to demand his inheritance early. Not all of it, she was too smart for such obvious greed, but enough to cripple the company's operational capacity. The paperwork outlined the transfer of 40% ownership of Harrison and Associates to David, along with liquidation rights that would force me to sell key assets to fund his buyout. Rebecca's strategy had been methodical and impressive in its calculation. She had spent 2 years slowly poisoning David against me, painting my dedication to the business as neglect of family, my high standards as impossible demands, my success as something that had come at his expense. She convinced him that I was aging out of relevance, that the agency needed fresh perspective to survive in the modern marketplace. Most devastatingly, she had managed to frame his inheritance claim as an act of mercy, rescuing the company from my declining capabilities while securing their financial future. What made her manipulation particularly insidious was how she framed it as love. She convinced David that demanding his inheritance was actually protecting me from the stress of running a company at my age. She painted a picture of graceful retirement, where I could step back and enjoy my golden years, while they revitalized Harrison and Associates with contemporary vision and energy. It was a beautiful narrative that appealed to David's inherent kindness while serving Rebecca's ambitions perfectly. The irony was that Rebecca actually possessed considerable business acumen. She had an MBA from Stanford and 5 years of experience at a competing firm before she married David. Her mistake wasn't lack of competence, it was assuming that her education and ambition had gone unnoticed by someone who had spent 4 decades reading people for a living. She thought she was manipulating a sentimental old woman who would crumble under family pressure. She had no idea she was playing chess with someone who had already mapped out the next 15 moves. I had watched Rebecca's campaign unfold, with the detached fascination of a researcher observing a particularly interesting specimen. Every lunch where she subtly criticized my management style, every family dinner where she questioned whether I was working too hard, every conversation where she planted seeds of doubt about my judgment. She was skilled, I had to give her credit for that. Her approach was sophisticated enough that David genuinely believed the concerns were his own, that he had independently concluded his mother needed saving from herself. The legal framework she had constructed was equally impressive. Working with her attorney, she had identified a rarely used provision in the company's partnership agreement that David could invoke as my designated heir. The clause had been inserted years ago as a safeguard against my potential incapacitation, but Rebecca had discovered it could be triggered by a formal request for early inheritance distribution. The language was just ambiguous enough to create legal uncertainty, forcing expensive litigation if I chose to resist. Her timing had been perfect as well. She had waited until our biggest client, Meridian Industries, was in the middle of a crisis management campaign that required my personal attention. She knew I couldn't afford the distraction of a prolonged legal battle while managing a multi-million-dollar account that demanded my full focus. The pressure was designed to force a quick settlement on terms favorable to David and Rebecca, with minimal resistance from me. What Rebecca failed to understand was that I had been expecting this exact scenario for over 2 years. Not because I possessed supernatural foresight, but because I understood her character with the clarity that comes from decades of reading people's motivations. She was ambitious, intelligent, and utterly convinced that her generation possessed insights that mine lacked. She viewed me as an obstacle to be removed rather than a resource to be leveraged. That fundamental misreading of the situation was about to cost her everything she thought she was gaining. The truth was that Harrison and Associates had been preparing for succession planning long before Rebecca ever entered our family. What she interpreted as my stubborn refusal to retire was actually a carefully orchestrated transition process that had been in development for 3 years. The company she thought she was acquiring was merely the visible surface of a much larger and more complex business structure that she had never bothered to investigate thoroughly. I had spent the previous 18 months quietly restructuring the agency's most valuable assets. The client relationships, intellectual property, and strategic partnerships that gave Harrison and Associates its competitive advantage had been transferred to a separate entity, Harrison Strategic Consulting, which existed as an independent company with its own management structure and financial systems. What remained under the Harrison and Associates umbrella was essentially a shell operation with impressive revenue streams but limited actual value. The beauty of this restructuring was its complete legality and transparency. Every transfer had been properly documented and filed with appropriate authorities. The information was available to anyone who conducted thorough due diligence, but Rebecca's attorney had focused exclusively on the original company's financial statements without investigating the broader corporate ecosystem. They saw revenue and assets without understanding that the real value had been systematically relocated beyond their reach. Rebecca had been so focused on claiming her prize that she had failed to ask the right questions. She wanted control of Harrison and Associates without understanding what that control actually entailed. She would soon discover that owning 40% of a company doesn't grant management authority when the remaining 60% is held by someone who understands corporate governance better than she understood manipulation. The documents I was about to sign would indeed transfer ownership as requested, but they would also trigger a series of cascading legal mechanisms that Rebecca's attorney had completely overlooked. Within 30 days of the ownership transfer, Harrison and Associates would be required to renegotiate its service agreements with Harrison Strategic Consulting. Since I controlled the strategic consulting firm, I would be in a position to terminate those agreements and transfer our most valuable clients to exclusive relationships with the new entity. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly sensing tension in the room that he couldn't quite identify. My son had always been sensitive to emotional undercurrents, a quality that made him excellent at client relations but vulnerable to manipulation by people like Rebecca. He genuinely believed he was helping me transition into retirement while securing his family's financial future. The guilt he felt about demanding his inheritance early was evident in every gesture, every avoided glance in my direction. Rebecca, meanwhile, radiated confident satisfaction. She had calculated this moment for months, convinced that she had identified my weakness and exploited it perfectly. Her strategy relied on my presumed emotional attachment to family harmony, the assumption that I would sacrifice business interests to avoid conflict with my son. She was about to learn that successful entrepreneurs don't build lasting companies by prioritizing sentiment over strategy. I picked up the pen and turned to face David directly, studying his familiar features one last time before everything changed between us. He had his father's strong jawline and my own green eyes, a combination that had made him handsome in an approachable way that clients found trustworthy. He was a good man who had made the mistake of marrying someone who viewed his family as resources to be managed rather than relationships to be cherished. The first document I signed transferred the requested ownership percentage to David, exactly as his attorney had demanded. Rebecca's smile widened slightly as she watched me complete each signature with careful precision. She believed she was witnessing my capitulation, the moment when age and exhaustion finally overcame business acumen. Her satisfaction was so complete that she failed to notice the additional paperwork I had prepared for this meeting. The second set of documents I placed on the desk outlined the terms of Harrison Strategic Consulting's independence from Harrison and Associates. These papers had been prepared by my own legal team over the previous 6 months, anticipating exactly this scenario. The language was complex, but the implications were straightforward. By accepting ownership of Harrison and Associates under the terms Rebecca had demanded, David would be agreeing to the dissolution of all service agreements between the two companies. Rebecca's expression began to shift as she realized there were additional documents involved in the transaction. Her attorney looked up from his phone for the first time since arriving, scanning the papers with growing concern. I watched their faces carefully as understanding began to dawn, their confidence slowly transforming into confusion and then alarm. The third document I signed was perhaps the most crucial. It formalized my resignation as CEO of Harrison and Associates, effective immediately upon completion of the ownership transfer. However, it also confirmed my exclusive employment contract with Harrison Strategic Consulting, along with non-compete clauses that prevented me from working with any company that competed with the strategic consulting firm. Since Harrison and Associates would now be competing with Harrison Strategic Consulting for the same clients, my son would be legally prohibited from accessing my expertise or industry relationships. David finally found his voice as the implications became clear. "Mother, what is all this? This isn't what we discussed." His tone carried genuine confusion rather than accusation, confirming my assessment that he had been manipulated rather than conspiring actively against me. Rebecca, however, had gone pale as she read through the additional documentation, her practiced composure finally cracking. "This is exactly what we discussed," I replied calmly, meeting David's eyes with steady resolve. "You requested early inheritance of your share in Harrison and Associates. I'm providing exactly that, along with all the legal responsibilities and limitations that ownership entails." I gestured toward the papers spread across my desk. "Everything is properly documented and legally binding. Your attorney can review the terms if you have questions about their validity." Rebecca's attorney was frantically scanning the documents, his phone forgotten as he tried to identify legal challenges to what I had presented. His growing frustration was evident as he realized that every aspect of the transfer had been structured to comply with existing laws and regulations. There were no procedural errors to exploit, no ambiguous language to challenge, no grounds for claiming coercion or undue influence. "You're sabotaging your own company," Rebecca said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is vindictive destruction of everything you've built." Her mask of respectful deference had finally slipped, revealing the calculating ambition that had always lurked beneath the surface. She was no longer pretending to care about my welfare or David's relationship with me. This was now purely about power and control. I smiled at her assessment, recognizing the irony in her accusation. "I'm not destroying anything, Rebecca. I'm simply ensuring that what I built remains under my control, rather than being transferred to people who don't understand its value." I stood and walked to the window overlooking the city skyline, giving myself a moment to appreciate the view I had earned through 4 decades of hard work and careful planning. Harrison and Associates was always just one component of a larger vision, I continued, turning back to face them. The real value was never in the company name or the office lease. It was in the relationships, the expertise, and the strategic capabilities that took years to develop. Those assets can't be claimed through legal documents or inheritance demands. They can only be earned through dedication and proven competence. David was studying the papers with growing comprehension, his business education finally allowing him to understand what had transpired.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
"You've moved all the important clients to another company," he said slowly, his voice carrying a mix of admiration and disappointment. "Harrison and Associates will be an empty shell within 6 months." He looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "This was planned. You knew exactly what Rebecca was going to do." "I knew that someone would eventually challenge my control of the company," I confirmed, returning to my desk to gather the signed documents. I prepared accordingly. Whether that challenge came from ambitious employees, hostile competitors, or family members seeking premature inheritance, the response was always going to be the same: protection of what matters most, preservation of what took decades to build. Rebecca had recovered enough to attempt one final manipulation. "David, you see what she's doing, don't you? She's punishing you for trying to help her retire gracefully. She'd rather destroy everything than share control with her own son." Her voice carried practiced hurt, the tone of someone whose generous intentions had been cruelly rebuffed by an unreasonable elder. But David was no longer listening to his wife with the same receptive attention he had shown for the past 2 years. The business acumen that had made him valuable at the agency was finally being applied to his personal relationships, and he was beginning to recognize manipulation techniques that had previously been invisible to him. "This isn't about punishment," he said quietly, still studying the documents. "This is about consequences. We demanded something without understanding what we were actually requesting." I felt a flash of pride at my son's insight, followed immediately by sadness at the realization that this moment of clarity had come too late to prevent the damage Rebecca's campaign had inflicted on our relationship. He was finally seeing the situation clearly, but only after committing to a course of action that would separate us permanently in any meaningful business capacity. "The paperwork will be filed this afternoon," I announced, placing the completed documents in a folder that my assistant would deliver to the appropriate legal offices. "David, you now own 40% of Harrison and Associates, along with all the rights and responsibilities that ownership entails. You'll receive quarterly financial statements and have voting rights on major corporate decisions affecting the company." "What will those statements show?" David asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. He had worked at the agency long enough to understand how client relationships drove revenue, and how quickly income could disappear when key accounts moved to competing firms. "Initially, they'll show the existing contracts and revenue streams you're inheriting today," I replied honestly. "After that, the numbers will reflect the competitive marketplace and your ability to retain clients without the strategic resources that Harrison Strategic Consulting will be offering exclusively to its own customers." I paused to let the implications settle. "Running a public relations firm requires more than ownership percentages, David. It requires expertise, relationships, and credibility that can't be transferred through legal documents." Rebecca's attorney finally spoke up, his voice carrying professional frustration mixed with personal embarrassment. "Mrs. Harrison, while these documents appear to be legally valid, the spirit of this transaction seems designed to circumvent the intent of my client's inheritance request. We reserve the right to challenge this arrangement in court." "Of course you do," I agreed pleasantly. "That's your professional responsibility. However, you should be aware that any legal challenge will trigger additional clauses in the ownership transfer agreement. Specifically, David's 40% stake will be held in trust pending resolution of the dispute, during which time Harrison and Associates will be managed exclusively by the majority shareholder, namely myself, with full authority to make operational decisions including client service agreements." The elegance of this additional protection became apparent as Rebecca's attorney absorbed its implications. Any attempt to challenge my restructuring would actually strengthen my control over Harrison and Associates while their inheritance remained tied up in litigation. They could pursue legal remedies, but doing so would guarantee the exact outcome they were trying to prevent. David closed his eyes briefly, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was overwhelmed by complex situations. "Mother, I think I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "I allowed myself to be convinced that you needed protection from your own business judgment. I should have trusted your experience and expertise instead of assuming I knew better." His acknowledgement of the manipulation touched me more deeply than I had expected. Despite everything that had transpired, David remained capable of growth and self-reflection. That quality had always been his greatest strength, even when it made him vulnerable to people who would exploit his willingness to see the best in others. "You don't owe me an apology for wanting financial security for your family," I replied, softening my tone slightly. "You owe yourself honesty about whose advice you're following and why they're offering it." I glanced meaningfully at Rebecca, who had been conspicuously silent since her attorney's failed challenge. Marriage should be based on mutual respect and shared values, not strategic alliances designed to advance individual ambitions. Rebecca finally found her voice again, though her words carried defensive anger rather than persuasive charm. "This isn't over, Margaret. You may have outmaneuvered us today, but David deserves his fair share of what you've built. He's your son, your only child, and he has every right to benefit from your success." Her appeal to family obligation was desperate and transparent, lacking the subtle manipulation that had characterized her previous approaches. "David will receive exactly what he's earned," I assured her, standing to indicate that our meeting was concluded. "He'll have ownership of a public relations company with existing clients and revenue streams. What he does with that opportunity will determine its future value. Success in business isn't inherited, Rebecca. It's achieved through competence, dedication, and the ability to serve clients better than your competitors." As they prepared to leave, David turned back with one final question: "Will Harrison Strategic Consulting be competing directly with Harrison and Associates?" His tone was purely professional now, seeking information rather than expressing hurt or anger. He was already beginning to think like a business owner rather than a disappointed son. "We'll be serving similar client needs in the same market," I confirmed. "Whether that constitutes direct competition will depend on your ability to differentiate your services and maintain customer loyalty without the strategic capabilities that made Harrison and Associates successful originally." I paused, allowing my words to carry their full weight. "The marketplace will ultimately determine which approach provides better value to clients." After they left, I remained in my office overlooking the Portland skyline, reflecting on the morning's events and their implications for our family's future. The business decisions had been straightforward applications of strategies I had developed over decades of corporate experience. The personal costs were more complex and would take longer to fully understand. Rebecca's manipulation had succeeded in one significant way. She had damaged my relationship with David, possibly permanently, by convincing him that business competition represented personal rejection. Even though he was beginning to recognize how he had been influenced, the hurt and disappointment of this morning would shape our interactions for years to come. Family trust, once broken, required considerable time and effort to rebuild. However, her larger strategy had failed completely. Instead of gaining control over my life's work, she had guaranteed its protection and continued growth under my direction. Harrison Strategic Consulting would thrive with the client relationships and strategic capabilities that had made Harrison and Associates valuable originally. The shell company David had inherited would struggle to compete without those advantages, ultimately proving the folly of seeking ownership without understanding operational requirements. The phone rang shortly after noon, interrupting my contemplation. My assistant announced that David was calling, requesting to speak with me privately. I accepted the call, curious about what he might want to discuss so soon after our difficult morning meeting. "Mother, I need you to know that I'm not going to let Rebecca manipulate me again," he said, without preamble, his voice carrying a determination I hadn't heard in years. "I spent the last 2 hours reviewing everything that happened, and I can see exactly how she orchestrated this situation. I was an idiot to go along with it, but I'm not going to compound that mistake by continuing to follow her lead." His acknowledgement of the manipulation was encouraging, though I wondered whether his recognition had come too late to prevent significant consequences for both our businesses and our relationship. "What are you planning to do, David?" I asked, genuinely curious about his next steps. "I'm going to try to make Harrison and Associates successful on its own merits," he replied. "I know it won't be easy with the client relationships and strategic resources you've moved to the consulting firm, but maybe that's exactly the challenge I need. I've been coasting on your success for too long, assuming that inheritance meant entitlement rather than opportunity." His response surprised me with its maturity and clear-eyed assessment of the situation. Perhaps Rebecca's manipulation had inadvertently provided David with the motivation he needed to develop his own business capabilities rather than relying on family connections and inherited advantages. "And Rebecca?" I asked, wondering how he planned to handle the wife who had orchestrated this entire situation for her own benefit. David was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Rebecca and I need to have some serious conversations about what marriage means and whether we share the same values about family, business, and integrity. I'm not sure those conversations are going to go well, but they're necessary regardless of the outcome." After ending the call, I felt cautiously optimistic about David's prospects for personal growth, even if our business relationship had been permanently altered. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from experiencing the full consequences of poor decisions rather than being protected from them by well-meaning family members. The afternoon brought a stream of calls from clients who had heard rumors about changes at Harrison and Associates. Word traveled quickly in Portland's business community, and any major corporate restructuring generated speculation about stability and service continuity. I spent several hours reassuring key accounts that their service would continue uninterrupted through Harrison Strategic Consulting, with the same personnel and strategic approach they had come to expect. One call came from Marcus Chen, the CEO of Meridian Industries, whose crisis management campaign had provided the timing pressure Rebecca thought would force my capitulation. "Margaret, we're hearing conflicting reports about ownership changes at your firm. Should we be concerned about project continuity or team stability?" His tone was professional but concerned, reflecting the natural anxiety clients feel when their service providers face internal disruption. "Marcus, you'll be pleased to know that your project team and strategic approach remain completely unchanged." I assured him. Harrison Strategic Consulting has assumed responsibility for all crisis management and strategic communication services previously handled by Harrison and Associates. The same personnel, the same methodologies, the same commitment to your success. "So this is essentially a rebranding rather than a business disruption?" he asked, seeking clarification about the practical implications for his company. "Think of it as evolution rather than revolution," I replied. "We're focusing exclusively on strategic consulting services, which allows us to provide more specialized expertise and attention to clients like Meridian. You'll actually receive enhanced service rather than disrupted service." By late afternoon, I had successfully contacted all major clients and reassured them about service continuity. The transition to Harrison Strategic Consulting would be seamless from their perspective, while providing me with a more focused business model and protection from future inheritance demands or hostile takeover attempts. Rebecca had unknowingly done me a significant favor by forcing this restructuring ahead of my original timeline. Instead of gradually transitioning away from Harrison and Associates over several years, I now had a clean break that allowed me to pursue the next phase of my career, without the baggage of family expectations or internal conflicts about succession planning. That evening, as I reviewed the day's events from my home office, I realized that Rebecca's comment about me not knowing what I was signing had contained an ironic truth. She was absolutely right that I knew exactly what I was destroying. The question she had failed to ask was whether what I was destroying deserved to be preserved, and whether what I was creating in its place might be more valuable than what I was giving up. Harrison and Associates had been my life's work for 3 decades, but it had also become a source of family tension and professional limitation. By allowing David and Rebecca to claim ownership of the company, I had freed myself to build something new without the constraints of family expectations or partnership disputes. Sometimes destruction is actually creation in disguise, clearing away what no longer serves to make room for what could be. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to my home office. David arrived alone, looking tired but determined, carrying a thick folder that I assumed contained business documents or legal papers related to our new arrangement. Instead, he placed a handwritten letter on my desk and asked me to read it while he waited. The letter was a detailed apology for allowing Rebecca to manipulate him into challenging my business judgment and demanding premature inheritance. More importantly, it included his recognition that my restructuring had been a brilliant strategic move rather than vindictive destruction. He acknowledged that Rebecca's influence had blinded him to my expertise and experience, leading him to underestimate both my capabilities and my commitment to protecting what we had built together. "I spent all night thinking about this situation," he explained after I finished reading. "I realized that you didn't just outmaneuver Rebecca yesterday. You created an opportunity for me to prove myself independently, without the safety net of your reputation and relationships. It's terrifying and exciting at the same time." His insight impressed me more than his apology. David was finally understanding that business success required more than inherited advantages or family connections. He was beginning to see ownership as responsibility rather than entitlement, which suggested that Rebecca's manipulation might ultimately contribute to his professional development in ways she never intended. "What do you plan to do with Harrison and Associates?" I asked, genuinely curious about his vision for the company's future direction. "I want to specialize in small business public relations," he replied, his voice gaining confidence as he outlined his strategy. "Most of your high-profile corporate clients have moved to Harrison Strategic Consulting, which actually creates an opportunity for me to focus on a market segment that's been underserved. Small businesses need professional PR services, but they can't afford the premium rates that corporate clients pay." His business plan demonstrated thoughtful analysis of market opportunities and realistic assessment of his competitive position. Instead of trying to compete directly with Harrison Strategic Consulting for corporate accounts, he was identifying a different customer base with distinct needs and budget constraints. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that successful entrepreneurs employed when facing challenging circumstances. "That's a smart approach," I acknowledged, feeling genuine pride in his business acumen. Small businesses often become large businesses, which means you'd be building relationships with tomorrow's corporate clients while serving today's emerging companies. It's a longer-term strategy, but potentially very rewarding. David smiled for the first time in weeks, his enthusiasm for the new direction evident in his expression. "I'll probably fail spectacularly at first, but at least I'll be failing on my own merits rather than succeeding because of inherited advantages. Rebecca doesn't understand why that matters to me, but I think you do." His comment about Rebecca suggested that their marriage was facing significant strain as he began asserting independence from her influence. I wondered whether she would be able to accept a husband who no longer followed her strategic guidance, or whether she would seek to reassert control through different manipulation techniques. "How is Rebecca handling your new perspective on the situation?" I asked carefully, not wanting to interfere in their relationship while being genuinely concerned about David's well-being. David's expression grew more serious as he considered his response. "She's angry that her plan didn't work, and she's frustrated that I'm not letting her direct my response to what happened yesterday. We're having some difficult conversations about respect, trust, and whether we share the same values about family and business relationships." His willingness to question Rebecca's influence marked a significant shift in their marriage dynamic. For the first time since their wedding, David was applying critical thinking to his wife's advice rather than accepting it automatically. Whether their relationship could survive that level of scrutiny remained to be seen. Over the following weeks, I watched with interest as both Harrison Strategic Consulting and the reconstituted Harrison and Associates found their respective rhythms in the marketplace. My new company thrived with existing corporate clients who appreciated the focused expertise and personalized attention that came with a smaller, more specialized firm. David's company struggled initially as he learned to manage operations without the support systems he had taken for granted, but gradually began attracting small business clients who valued his enthusiasm and competitive pricing. Rebecca, meanwhile, had grown increasingly distant from both David and me as her strategic influence waned, and her manipulation became more transparent. She had taken a position with a competing PR firm, ostensibly to support the family financially while David built his business, but more likely to maintain professional relevance independent of Harrington family connections. The separation between Harrison Strategic Consulting and Harrison and Associates had accomplished exactly what I had intended. It protected my life's work from premature transfer to people who didn't understand its value, while creating opportunities for David to develop genuine business expertise, rather than relying on inherited advantages. The process had been painful for all involved, but the outcome suggested it had been necessary for everyone's long-term success and personal growth. 6 months after Rebecca had confidently declared that I didn't know what I was signing, I hosted a small celebration in my office overlooking the Portland skyline. Harrison Strategic Consulting had exceeded its revenue projections for the first half of the year, while David's Harrison and Associates had successfully launched 3 small business campaigns and secured its first long-term retainer client. Most importantly, David and I had begun rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than family obligation. We met monthly for lunch to discuss business challenges and share industry insights, our conversations marked by the professional courtesy that comes from recognizing each other's competence and independence. Rebecca had been absolutely right about one thing. I had known exactly what I was destroying when I signed those documents. I was destroying the assumption that family connections entitled anyone to inherit what they hadn't earned. I was destroying the illusion that age and experience could be easily manipulated by ambitious youth. Most of all, I was destroying a business structure that had outlived its usefulness, replacing it with something more dynamic, focused, and personally fulfilling. Sometimes the most important signature you can provide isn't on a contract or agreement, but on a permission slip that allows yourself to become who you were always meant to be, regardless of other people's expectations or assumptions about your capabilities. Rebecca thought she was witnessing my defeat, but she was actually attending the birth of my next chapter, one that would be written entirely on my own terms. 3 weeks after the ownership transfer, Rebecca's calculated composure had completely evaporated. She paced the length of our downtown apartment like a caged animal, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors with increasing intensity. The financial statements from Harrison and Associates had arrived that morning, and the numbers told a story she hadn't anticipated when she orchestrated what she believed would be our financial liberation. David sat at our dining room table, surrounded by spreadsheets and legal documents, his expression growing more grim as he absorbed the implications of what we had actually acquired. The revenue projections that had looked so promising 3 weeks ago were already beginning to deteriorate as clients received notices about service transitions and partnership dissolutions. What had appeared to be a thriving business was revealing itself to be a carefully constructed facade that dissolved the moment Margaret withdrew her strategic resources. I had spent the better part of 2 years positioning myself as the concerned daughter-in-law who only wanted what was best for the family. Every conversation with David had been carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt about his mother's judgment, while positioning myself as the voice of reason advocating for his rightful inheritance. I had studied Margaret's business operations, identified what I believed were vulnerabilities in her management approach, and developed what I thought was a foolproof strategy for gaining control of Harrison and Associates. The irony was that I genuinely possessed the business expertise to manage a public relations firm successfully. My MBA from Stanford hadn't been decorative, and my 5 years at Morrison Communications had provided real-world experience in client management, strategic planning, and operational efficiency. What I had underestimated was Margaret's ability to anticipate challenges and prepare countermeasures that went far beyond what traditional business education had taught me about corporate succession. My mistake had been assuming that emotional manipulation would be sufficient to overcome strategic planning. I had focused on convincing David that his mother needed protection from her own declining capabilities, that her advanced age made her vulnerable to poor judgment, that family duty required him to step in before she damaged the business beyond repair. I had crafted a narrative that appealed to his natural kindness while serving my ambitions for financial security and professional advancement. The reality was that I had never truly understood what made Harrison and Associates valuable in the first place. I had seen the revenue streams, the client roster, and the office infrastructure, but I had failed to recognize that the real assets were intangible. Margaret's reputation, her strategic relationships, her expertise in crisis management, her understanding of Portland's business community, these were the elements that generated success, and they couldn't be transferred through ownership documents. David looked up from the financial statements with an expression that mixed disappointment with grudging admiration. "She moved everything that mattered to Harrison Strategic Consulting," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the anger I had expected. "The client relationships, the strategic partnerships, even most of the experienced staff. We own a company name and an office lease, but the actual business went with her." His calm acceptance of the situation frustrated me more than rage would have. I had expected him to be furious about his mother's manipulation, to see her restructuring as betrayal rather than strategic brilliance. Instead, he was analyzing the situation with the kind of objective assessment that made him effective in business but useless for the righteous indignation I needed to fuel our next moves. She deliberately sabotaged what should have been your inheritance, I insisted, moving to stand behind his chair and place my hands on his shoulders. This isn't business strategy, David. This is personal vengeance because you dared to question her absolute control over everything she built. I tried to inject hurt and outrage into my voice, hoping to trigger the emotional response that logical analysis hadn't produced. David shrugged away from my touch, a gesture that surprised me with its firmness. Over the past 2 years, he had been increasingly receptive to my guidance, more willing to see situations through my perspective than to trust his own instincts. This new resistance suggested that Margaret's maneuvering had accomplished more than just protecting her business assets. It had apparently awakened David's dormant ability to think independently about our relationship and my motivations. Actually, I think this might be exactly the business strategy she should have employed, he replied, turning in his chair to face me directly. Rebecca, think about it logically. We demanded immediate inheritance of a 40% stake in her life's work. We threatened legal action if she refused. We essentially forced her to choose between family harmony and business security. He paused, studying my expression with uncomfortable intensity. What did we expect her to do? Just hand over control and hope for the best? His analysis of our actions stung because it contained uncomfortable truth. We had approached Margaret's business as if it were a bank account to be divided rather than a living enterprise that required expertise and relationships to maintain its value. I had convinced David that ownership entitled him to immediate benefit, without corresponding responsibility, that inheritance meant receiving results without understanding the processes that created them. The phone rang, interrupting our increasingly tense conversation. David answered with cautious professionalism, his tone suggesting he expected bad news. After a brief exchange, he hung up with a sigh that confirmed my suspicions. Coastal Development just terminated their contract, he informed me. They're moving to Harrison Strategic Consulting for their upcoming project launch. Coastal Development had been one of Harrison and Associates' most reliable clients, providing steady revenue through multiple projects over the past 3 years. Their departure represented both immediate financial loss and symbolic confirmation that Margaret's strategy was working exactly as she had planned. Clients were choosing expertise over loyalty, following the strategic resources, rather than honoring historical relationships. How many does that make? I asked, though I already knew the answer from my own careful tracking of client departures. 7 major accounts had moved to Harrison Strategic Consulting in the past 3 weeks, each citing needs for specialized expertise that Harrison and Associates could no longer provide. The pattern was clear and devastating to our revenue projections. David consulted his notebook, where he had been documenting each client conversation with the methodical attention to detail that had made him valuable at his mother's firm. 7 departures, 2 cancellations, and 3 requests for service reductions, he summarized. We're looking at approximately 60% revenue decline within the first month, unless we can replace those accounts quickly. The magnitude of our problem was becoming undeniable. Even if David managed to retain the remaining clients, Harrison and Associates would be operating at a significant loss within 60 days. We needed new business immediately, but our reputation in Portland's business community was being undermined by the very public nature of our separation from Margaret's expertise and strategic resources. I had anticipated some client uncertainty during the transition, but I had underestimated how quickly business relationships could shift when key personnel and capabilities were no longer available. Margaret's 40 years in Portland had created a network of trust and credibility that couldn't be replicated simply by inheriting her company's legal structure. We need to hire experienced staff immediately, I declared, moving to our laptop to begin researching available talent in Portland's public relations market. If we can recruit senior associates from competing firms, we can rebuild the expertise that Margaret took with her to Harrison Strategic Consulting. It was a logical approach that addressed our most obvious weakness, though it would require significant financial investment at exactly the moment when our revenue was collapsing. David shook his head slowly, his expression suggesting he had already considered and rejected this strategy. Rebecca, experienced PR professionals aren't going to leave stable positions to join a company that's visibly struggling. We can't offer competitive salaries when our revenue is declining, and we can't promise job security when our client base is evaporating. He gestured toward the financial statements spread across our table. We need to find a different approach. His realistic assessment of our hiring prospects frustrated me because it eliminated what seemed like the most obvious solution to our staffing problems. I had assumed that Margaret's departure would create opportunities for us to recruit disgruntled employees or ambitious professionals seeking advancement opportunities. Instead, the market was treating Harrison and Associates as a sinking ship rather than an emerging opportunity. "Then what do you suggest?" I asked, trying to keep accusation out of my voice. "We can't run a public relations firm without experienced staff, and we can't attract experienced staff without competitive compensation and job security. How exactly do you propose to solve this problem?" David was quiet for several minutes, studying the financial documents with the kind of concentrated attention that usually preceded one of his strategic insights. When he finally spoke, his words carried a conviction that surprised me with its determination. "We're going to have to rebuild from the ground up, focusing on clients and markets that don't overlap with Harrison's strategic consulting." His proposal seemed like surrender disguised as strategy. Instead of competing directly with Margaret for the corporate accounts that generated substantial revenue, he was suggesting we pursue smaller clients with limited budgets and reduced prestige. It felt like accepting defeat before we had even attempted to fight for what should have been ours by right of inheritance. "You're talking about starting over completely," I said, unable to hide my disappointment in his apparent lack of ambition. "David, you're heir to one of Portland's most successful PR firms. You shouldn't have to build from scratch when your inheritance should have provided established success." David's expression hardened slightly, a hint of his mother's steely determination showing through his usually accommodating personality. "My inheritance provided exactly what it promised, Rebecca. Ownership of Harrison and Associates, along with all the opportunities and challenges that ownership entails." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with uncomfortably direct attention. "What I inherited wasn't guaranteed success. It was the chance to earn success through my own efforts and capabilities." His reframing of the situation revealed a shift in perspective that I found deeply troubling. Instead of viewing Margaret's restructuring as betrayal, he was beginning to see it as motivation. Rather than feeling cheated by the loss of established advantages, he was embracing the challenge of proving himself independently. This was not the response I had cultivated during 2 years of careful influence. The doorbell interrupted our conversation, providing a temporary reprieve from the increasingly uncomfortable direction of our discussion. David went to answer it while I remained at the dining room table, surrounded by evidence of how thoroughly my strategic planning had backfired. Instead of gaining control of a successful business, we had acquired responsibility for a failing enterprise. Instead of securing financial independence, we had created financial liability. David returned carrying a large envelope with Margaret's business address in the return corner. His expression was puzzled as he examined the official-looking document, clearly unexpected mail from his mother so soon after their business separation. He opened it carefully, scanning the contents with growing surprise before handing the papers to me for review. The envelope contained a comprehensive business proposal from Harrison Strategic Consulting, offering to provide transitional support services to Harrison and Associates during our initial operational period. The document outlined specific areas where Margaret's firm could assist with client retention, staff training, and strategic planning, all for fees that were surprisingly reasonable given the competitive circumstances. "She's offering to help us succeed," David said, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and cautious hope. "After everything that happened, after the way we challenged her authority and demanded our inheritance, she's actually providing resources to help us build something sustainable." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. This isn't what I expected from someone who was supposedly being vindictive. The proposal was indeed generous, more generous than business logic would suggest given our recent adversarial relationship. Margaret was offering consulting services at rates significantly below market value, access to training resources that would benefit our staff development, and even potential client referrals for accounts that didn't align with Harrison's Strategic Consulting's strategic focus. My initial reaction was suspicion. After orchestrating such an elaborate protection of her business assets, why would Margaret now offer assistance to the company she had deliberately weakened? The proposal seemed inconsistent with someone who had just executed a brilliant defensive strategy against family pressure. There had to be additional motivations that weren't immediately apparent. This could be another manipulation, I warned David, though I struggled to identify what advantage Margaret might gain from our success. She might be positioning herself to maintain control over Harrison and Associates indirectly, using consulting agreements to influence our operations and strategic decisions. It was the most logical explanation for behavior that otherwise seemed counterproductive to her own business interests. David studied the proposal more carefully, his business education helping him analyze the specific terms and conditions Margaret had outlined. Actually, the agreement gives us complete operational independence, he observed, after reviewing the legal language. She's offering support services, not management authority. We retain full control over strategic decisions, client relationships, and business development. He looked up from the documents with growing interest. This is mentorship, not manipulation. His interpretation of Margaret's offer revealed how much his perspective had shifted since our confrontation 3 weeks ago. Instead of viewing his mother's actions through the lens of family conflict, he was beginning to assess them as business decisions made by someone with considerably more experience and expertise than either of us possessed. The question was whether he would accept her guidance or continue to view their relationship as fundamentally adversarial. I realized that this moment represented a crucial decision point for our marriage and our business future. David was being offered an opportunity to rebuild his relationship with Margaret while developing genuine business capabilities under her guidance. If he accepted her proposal, he would be acknowledging that our inheritance demand had been premature, and that his mother's resistance had been justified by our lack of readiness. You can't be seriously considering accepting help from the woman who just sabotaged our inheritance, I said, trying to reignite the sense of betrayal that had motivated David's original demand for early ownership transfer. David, she deliberately structured this situation to make us fail. Now she's offering to rescue us, but only on her terms and only if we admit that she was right about our capabilities. David was quiet for a long moment, considering both the proposal and my objection to it. When he finally responded, his words carried a maturity that surprised me with its clarity. Rebecca, what if she was right about our capabilities? What if demanding immediate inheritance was premature, and what if her restructuring was necessary to protect something valuable from our inexperience? He gestured toward the financial statements that documented our declining situation. The evidence suggests that we weren't ready for what we demanded. His willingness to question our original strategy represented a fundamental shift in his thinking that threatened everything I had worked to achieve. If David began viewing Margaret as a mentor rather than an obstacle, if he started trusting her business judgment more than my strategic guidance, then my influence over both our marriage and our professional future would be significantly diminished. So you're just going to surrender completely? I asked, allowing hurt and disappointment to color my voice. After everything we went through to claim your rightful inheritance, you're ready to go back to being your mother's subordinate, accepting whatever scraps she's willing to offer. It was an emotional appeal designed to trigger his pride and independence, qualities that had motivated his original inheritance demand. David looked at me with an expression that mixed sadness with determination. I'm going to try to learn from someone who successfully built what I'm trying to create, he replied calmly. Rebecca, pride isn't a business strategy, neither is resentment or family conflict. If Margaret is offering to help us succeed, then rejecting that help because of wounded ego would be the kind of poor judgment that proves we weren't ready for immediate inheritance in the first place. His response revealed how completely my carefully constructed narrative had collapsed. Instead of viewing Margaret as the enemy who had stolen our rightful success, David was beginning to see her as a resource who could help us earn genuine achievement. The victim mentality I had cultivated was being replaced by personal responsibility and strategic thinking. That evening, David called Margaret to accept her consulting proposal and schedule their first planning meeting. I listened to their conversation from the kitchen, noting how their professional tone had replaced the emotional tension that had characterized their recent interactions. They were beginning to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than family obligation or resentment. After hanging up, David found me in our bedroom, where I had been reviewing job listings at competing PR firms. The prospect of our business failure had forced me to consider alternative career options that would provide the financial security and professional advancement I had sought through marriage and inheritance manipulation. If Harrison and Associates couldn't be salvaged, then I needed to position myself for opportunities elsewhere. Margaret wants to meet tomorrow morning to review our current client situation and develop a strategic plan for business development. David informed me, his voice carrying an enthusiasm I hadn't heard since before our inheritance campaign began. She's bringing her senior associates to share insights about market opportunities and operational efficiency. His excitement about working with Margaret again highlighted how much our relationship dynamic had changed over the past 3 weeks. The man who had once followed my strategic guidance was now making independent decisions about business and family relationships. The influence I had carefully cultivated was dissolving as David rediscovered his confidence in his own judgment. "Are you expecting me to participate in this meeting?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Margaret had structured her proposal to work directly with David, not with the daughter-in-law who had orchestrated the inheritance challenge that necessitated her defensive restructuring. My presence would likely be unwelcome and probably counterproductive. David's hesitation before responding confirmed my suspicions. "Margaret's focus is on helping Harrison and Associates succeed as a business," he said carefully. "Your expertise is valuable, but your relationship with her is complicated right now. Maybe it would be better if I handled the initial planning sessions and then shared the insights with you afterward." His diplomatic exclusion of me from the business planning process marked another step in his growing independence from my influence. Instead of insisting that I be included as his partner and equal, he was accepting Margaret's implicit preference for working with him directly. The united front we had presented during our inheritance demand was completely dissolved. Over the following weeks, I watched from the sidelines as David and Margaret began rebuilding both their business relationship and their personal connection. Their morning meetings evolved into collaborative planning sessions that often extended into lunch, their conversations mixing strategic discussions with the kind of family interaction that had been missing since our marriage began. David's transformation was remarkable and deeply threatening to everything I had worked to achieve. Under Margaret's guidance, he developed genuine expertise in small business public relations, learning to identify opportunities that larger firms overlooked and to provide personalized service that corporate clients couldn't receive elsewhere. His confidence grew as he successfully managed increasingly complex projects, proving to himself that he could succeed through competence rather than inherited advantage. Meanwhile, Harrison and Associates began stabilizing and eventually growing as David implemented the strategies he learned from his mother's consulting sessions. The small business focus that had initially seemed like surrender was actually providing sustainable revenue and genuine market differentiation. By the end of the second month, they had signed 6 new clients and successfully retained 3 of their original accounts. Margaret's prediction about small businesses becoming large businesses proved accurate as well. 2 of David's new clients expanded significantly during their first quarter, requiring additional services that generated increased revenue and strengthened relationships. The long-term strategy she had recommended was already showing results that vindicated her approach. My own situation became increasingly untenable as David's success highlighted the contrast between his growth and my stagnation. While he was building genuine business capabilities under his mother's guidance, I remained focused on resentment and strategic planning for advantages that no longer existed. My expertise was real, but my perspective had become counterproductive to the collaborative relationship that David was developing with Margaret. The breaking point came during a family dinner that Margaret had suggested to celebrate Harrison and Associates' first profitable quarter since the ownership transfer. David had enthusiastically accepted the invitation, viewing it as an opportunity to demonstrate the progress he had made and to begin healing the family relationships that our inheritance campaign had damaged. I attended reluctantly, aware that my presence would be awkward but unwilling to let David navigate this crucial interaction without my support and oversight. The dinner took place at Margaret's home, the same house where David had grown up, and where I had never felt entirely welcome despite 5 years of marriage to her son. Margaret's approach to the evening surprised me with its warmth and genuine celebration of David's achievements. Instead of the subtle criticism or condescending pride I had expected, she expressed authentic admiration for the business acumen he had developed and the challenges he had overcome during his transition to independent management. She treated him as a professional equal rather than a son who needed protection or guidance. Your small business strategy is working better than I anticipated, Margaret told David as we reviewed the quarterly financial statements over dessert. The market segment you identified has more growth potential than the corporate accounts that originally built Harrison and Associates. You're positioning yourself for sustainable long-term success rather than depending on inherited relationships. Her praise was specific and substantive, focusing on David's strategic decisions rather than offering generic encouragement. She was acknowledging that his approach had exceeded her expectations, that he had found solutions to challenges that experience alone couldn't have predicted. It was the kind of professional recognition that David had always sought but never received when working as her employee. I couldn't have done this without your consulting support, David replied, his gratitude genuine but not subservient. The transition period would have been devastating without the guidance you provided, and the client referrals that kept us afloat during the first month. He paused, meeting his mother's eyes directly. I also couldn't have done it while still depending on inherited advantages rather than earned capabilities. Their exchange highlighted how completely their relationship had transformed since our inheritance demand 3 months earlier. Instead of the tension and resentment that had characterized their interactions during my campaign, they now shared mutual respect based on professional competence and personal growth. David had proven himself capable of independent success, while Margaret had demonstrated that her protective restructuring had been motivated by wisdom rather than vindictiveness. I felt increasingly invisible during their celebration, my presence acknowledged politely but not valued meaningfully. The strategic insights and business expertise that had once made me essential to David's decision-making were now redundant given his direct access to Margaret's superior knowledge and experience. My role in his life was becoming ornamental rather than instrumental. After dinner, as Margaret and David discussed plans for expanding Harrison and Associates into new service areas, I excused myself to walk alone in the garden where David had played as a child. The evening air was cool and clear, providing perspective on how completely my strategy had backfired and how uncertain my future had become. When David found me 20 minutes later, his expression carried concern mixed with determination. "Rebecca, we need to talk about where things stand between us," he said quietly, his tone suggesting he had been preparing for this conversation throughout the evening. "I think we both know that our relationship has changed significantly since the inheritance situation, and we need to decide whether we can build something authentic moving forward." His directness surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have given how much he had grown in confidence and clarity over the past 3 months. The man who had once deferred to my judgment in both personal and professional matters was now prepared to make difficult decisions based on his own assessment of our relationship's viability. "What exactly are you saying, David?" I asked, though I suspected I already understood the implications of his serious tone and careful choice of words. The foundation of our marriage had been built on his dependence on my guidance and my access to his family's resources. With both of those elements eliminated, we needed to discover whether anything genuine remained between us. David was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully before responding. "I'm saying that I need to understand whether you married me because you loved who I was, or because you saw opportunities to influence what I could become," he said finally. "The past 3 months have shown me that I'm capable of making good decisions independently, and I need a partner who respects that capability, rather than trying to manipulate it for their own purposes." His question cut to the heart of our relationship's fundamental dynamic. Had I married David because I genuinely loved him, or because I recognized his potential as a vehicle for advancing my own ambitions? The honest answer was uncomfortable to acknowledge even to myself, much less to him. My feelings for David had always been complicated by my assessment of what he could provide in terms of social status, financial security, and professional opportunities. "I married you because I saw potential in our life together," I replied carefully, trying to balance honesty with self-preservation. Maybe I was too focused on what we could achieve rather than who we already were, but that doesn't mean my feelings weren't genuine. It was a partial truth that acknowledged my strategic thinking without fully confessing the extent of my manipulation. David nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he had expected this level of qualified honesty. "Rebecca, I think we both know that our marriage has been more about strategy than emotion, more about what we could gain together than what we could give each other," he said with a sadness that struck me as genuine rather than accusatory. I'm not sure either of us is entirely to blame for that, but I'm also not sure it's sustainable now that our circumstances have changed so dramatically. His assessment of our relationship was accurate enough to be painful. We had approached marriage as a business partnership rather than an emotional commitment, each seeking advantages that the other could provide rather than building authentic intimacy and shared values. The inheritance campaign had simply made those underlying dynamics more obvious and ultimately unsustainable. Standing in Margaret's garden under the Portland evening sky, I realized that my carefully constructed life was dissolving around me. The marriage I had cultivated for strategic purposes was ending as David developed independence from my influence. The inheritance I had orchestrated to claim had been transformed into a struggling business that required capabilities I didn't possess. The professional advancement I had sought through family connections was being replaced by the need to rebuild my career on my own merits. David was offering me the same opportunity that Margaret had provided him. The chance to discover what I could achieve through my own efforts rather than through manipulation of other people's resources and relationships. The question was whether I possessed the courage and capability to accept that challenge, or whether I would continue trying to salvage advantages that no longer existed. What happens now? I asked, recognizing that our conversation was moving toward decisions that would reshape both our lives in fundamental ways. David had found his path forward through honest acknowledgement of his mistakes and commitment to earning rather than inheriting success. I needed to determine whether I was capable of similar growth and authenticity. David's response came with the quiet confidence that had emerged as his most attractive quality during these months of challenge and change. Now we each figure out who we really are when we're not trying to be what someone else expects or what circumstances seem to require, he said simply. Maybe we discover that we can build something real together on a foundation of honesty rather than strategy. Maybe we discover that we're better people apart than we were together. Either way, we stop pretending that manipulation and calculation are substitutes for genuine connection and shared values. His words carried the wisdom that Margaret had helped him develop during their business mentoring sessions. The same principles that made Harrison and Associates successful, honesty, competence, and authentic value creation, were the principles that healthy relationships required. Strategy and manipulation might produce short-term advantages, but they couldn't sustain long-term success in either business or marriage. As we walked back toward the house where Margaret was cleaning up from our celebration dinner, I found myself facing the same choice that David had confronted 3 months earlier. I could continue trying to preserve advantages through manipulation and resentment, or I could accept the opportunity to build something authentic through my own efforts and capabilities. The path forward required abandoning the strategic approach that had defined my adult life and embracing the uncertainty that comes with genuine personal growth. Margaret was waiting in the kitchen when we returned, her expression suggesting she understood that David and I had been having a significant conversation. She had probably anticipated this moment, just as she had anticipated every other development in the complex family drama that my inheritance campaign had initiated. Her experience with human nature and strategic thinking extended far beyond business applications. Rebecca, I want you to know that David's success over the past 3 months has been entirely his own achievement, she said as we prepared to leave. The consulting support I provided was available to anyone with similar dedication and willingness to learn. What made the difference was his commitment to earning rather than inheriting, to building rather than simply claiming. She paused, meeting my eyes directly. Those same opportunities are available to anyone ready to pursue them honestly. Her words were both acknowledgement of David's growth and invitation for my own development. Margaret was offering me the same respect she had extended to David once he demonstrated genuine commitment to personal and professional growth. The question was whether I possessed the humility and courage to accept guidance from someone I had tried to manipulate and ultimately failed to outmaneuver. The drive home was quiet, both David and I lost in our own thoughts about the evening's conversations and their implications for our future. We had reached a point where pretense was no longer sustainable, where the strategic calculations that had brought us together were being replaced by questions about authentic compatibility and shared values. That night, as I lay awake reviewing the events of the past 3 months, I finally understood what Margaret had meant when she said I didn't know what I was signing. She hadn't been referring to the legal documents that transferred ownership of Harrison and Associates. She had been talking about the broader consequences of approaching family relationships as strategic opportunities rather than emotional commitments. By convincing David to demand his inheritance prematurely, I had indeed destroyed something valuable. Not Margaret's business empire, which she had successfully protected and enhanced through her strategic restructuring. What I had destroyed was the possibility of building authentic relationships based on trust and mutual respect rather than manipulation and calculation. The question now was whether destruction could become a form of creation, clearing away pretense to make room for something more genuine. David had accepted that challenge and was already showing remarkable results. Whether I possessed similar courage remained to be discovered, but for the first time in years, I was ready to find out who I might become when I stopped trying to be what I thought others wanted or what circumstances seemed to require. The private investigator's report arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by courier to my downtown office with the kind of discreet efficiency that expensive professionals provided when handling sensitive information. I had hired Catherine Walsh 3 weeks earlier, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I needed comprehensive understanding of the forces that had been working against my family's stability for the past 2 years. Margaret Harrison sat across from my mahogany desk, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, her expression maintaining the composed professionalism that had made her legendary in Portland's business community. At 68, she possessed the kind of understated authority that came from decades of successful decision-making under pressure. What she didn't know was that the manila envelope between us contained evidence that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her son's marriage and her daughter-in-law's motivations. The investigation had been necessary not for revenge, but for protection. After Rebecca's failed attempt to manipulate David into claiming premature inheritance, after the calculated campaign to undermine my business judgment and force early succession, I needed to understand the full scope of what we were dealing with. Strategic defense required complete intelligence about your opponent's capabilities, resources, and potential future actions. Catherine Walsh had been thorough in ways that even my experienced expectations hadn't anticipated. The woman who had spent 20 years investigating corporate fraud and personal deception had uncovered a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond Rebecca's manipulation of my son. What emerged from 3 weeks of discreet inquiry was a portrait of someone whose entire adult life had been built around identifying opportunities to advance through strategic relationships rather than personal achievement. The report contained documentation spanning 5 years, beginning before Rebecca had even met David at a charity fundraiser that she had attended specifically because she knew it would attract eligible men from prominent Portland families. Her approach to courtship had been methodical and calculated, researching David's background, interests, and family dynamics before orchestrating what appeared to be a chance encounter at the museum gala that April evening. According to Catherine's findings, Rebecca had spent 2 weeks preparing for that initial meeting. She had studied articles about Harrison and Associates to demonstrate knowledge of David's professional interests. She had researched my own background to understand family dynamics and potential pressure points. She had even taken a weekend course in sailing because David's social media indicated it was his favorite recreational activity. Nothing about their romance had been left to chance or genuine attraction. The financial aspects of her background were equally revealing. Rebecca's student loans from Stanford remained substantial despite her MBA and 5 years of professional employment, suggesting either poor financial management or lifestyle choices that exceeded her earning capacity. Her credit history showed a pattern of high-end purchases followed by payment difficulties, the behavior of someone who maintained expensive appearances while struggling with underlying financial insecurity. More disturbing were the references Catherine had discovered from Rebecca's previous relationships. 3 men over the past 7 years, each from families with significant business holdings, each relationship ending abruptly once it became clear that marriage wasn't likely or that financial benefits wouldn't materialize as expected. The pattern was consistent and calculating, a systematic approach to romantic relationships as investment opportunities rather than emotional connections. Margaret reviewed the documents with the same methodical attention she applied to business analysis, her expression remaining neutral despite the disturbing implications of what she was discovering. She had suspected manipulation during Rebecca's inheritance campaign, but the evidence suggested something far more comprehensive and predatory than family conflict or generational misunderstanding. "How long has this been going on?" she asked after finishing the section detailing Rebecca's romantic history. Her voice carried professional curiosity rather than emotional reaction, approaching the information as data to be analyzed rather than personal betrayal to be mourned. Catherine traced the pattern back at least 8 years. I replied, opening to a timeline that showed Rebecca's systematic targeting of wealthy men. Each relationship followed similar patterns. Extensive research about the target's background and interests, carefully orchestrated meetings designed to appear coincidental, rapid progression to emotional intimacy, and strategic pressure for financial commitment or family access. The documentation was comprehensive enough to be disturbing. Rebecca hadn't simply been an ambitious woman seeking advantageous marriage, she had been operating what amounted to a sophisticated long-term con game, using emotional manipulation to extract financial benefits from unsuspecting men who believed they were in authentic romantic relationships. Margaret studied photographs that Catherine had obtained showing Rebecca at various social events over the past 3 years, often in conversation with other wealthy businessmen despite being married to David. The images suggested ongoing networking activities that extended beyond innocent professional development, particularly given the intimate nature of several conversations captured by the investigator's long-range camera. She was maintaining multiple options, Margaret observed, her tone carrying the kind of analytical detachment that successful executives applied to unpleasant but necessary business decisions. Even while married to David, she was continuing to cultivate relationships with other potential targets. She paused, studying one particular photograph that showed Rebecca in close conversation with Marcus Thompson, heir to a shipping fortune. This level of deception requires considerable planning and psychological sophistication. The most damaging section of the report detailed Rebecca's financial activities during her marriage to David. Despite their comfortable lifestyle and his generous approach to household expenses, she had been systematically transferring money to private accounts that David knew nothing about. The amounts weren't large enough to trigger suspicion, but they accumulated to nearly $60,000 over their 5-year marriage. Catherine had also uncovered evidence of Rebecca's attempts to access David's trust fund information through social engineering techniques applied to his financial advisors. She had posed as his assistant on multiple occasions, seeking details about inheritance schedules and asset distributions that would help her plan future manipulation strategies. The attempts had been unsuccessful, but they demonstrated premeditation that extended far beyond opportunistic gold digging. The inheritance demand wasn't spontaneous, Margaret concluded after reviewing the financial investigation results. This was a calculated extraction attempt that she had been planning for at least 18 months, possibly longer. She looked up from the documents with an expression that mixed admiration with disgust. I have to admit her strategic thinking was sophisticated. If she had been applying this level of planning to legitimate business activities, she could have been quite successful. The psychological profile that Catherine had commissioned from a consulting forensic psychologist painted Rebecca as someone with narcissistic personality traits combined with exceptional emotional intelligence. She possessed the ability to read people's motivations and vulnerabilities with remarkable accuracy, but she used those insights exclusively for personal advantage rather than building genuine relationships or contributing value to others. According to the analysis, Rebecca likely viewed other people as resources to be managed rather than individuals deserving respect and honesty. Her capacity for authentic emotional connection was limited, though her ability to simulate genuine feelings was highly developed. She was essentially a predator who had learned to disguise her predatory nature through charm, intelligence, and careful attention to social expectations. Margaret closed the report and leaned back in her chair, processing the implications of what we had discovered. David doesn't know any of this, she said finally, though it was more observation than question. The evidence suggested that her son had been completely deceived about his wife's true nature and motivations throughout their entire relationship. Catherine was discreet in her investigation methods. I assured her, David has no knowledge of the background research, and Rebecca has no reason to suspect she's been exposed. The question now is how to proceed with this information. I had hired the investigator for strategic intelligence, but using the findings required careful consideration of consequences for everyone involved. Margaret was quiet for several minutes, her expression suggesting the kind of complex calculation that had made her successful in crisis management for 4 decades. She was weighing multiple factors: David's emotional well-being, the family's reputation, legal implications of Rebecca's deceptions, and strategic options for protecting against future manipulation attempts. "We need to consider David's psychological state," she said eventually. "Learning that his entire marriage has been built on deception and manipulation will be devastating. He's just beginning to recover his confidence and independence after the inheritance situation. This could destroy the progress he's made." Her concern for her son's emotional welfare was genuine, though it competed with her recognition that ongoing deception would be ultimately more harmful. The timing was indeed problematic. David had spent the past 3 months rebuilding his self-respect and business capabilities under Margaret's guidance. He was finally developing the kind of authentic confidence that came from earned achievement rather than inherited advantage. Discovering that his marriage had been a sophisticated con game could undermine his growing trust in his own judgment and decision-making abilities. However, allowing Rebecca to continue her deception posed different but equally serious risks. The investigation had revealed that she was already cultivating relationships with other potential targets, suggesting that her marriage to David was becoming less valuable to her as a long-term strategy. If she decided to abandon him for a more advantageous relationship, the emotional damage could be even more severe if he remained ignorant of her true nature. "There's another consideration," I pointed out, opening to a section of the report that detailed Rebecca's recent activities. Catherine documented several meetings between Rebecca and divorce attorneys over the past month. She's already planning her exit strategy, probably calculating how to maximize financial benefit from ending the marriage. The evidence suggested that Rebecca was preparing to abandon David regardless of our decisions about disclosure. Margaret studied the surveillance photographs showing Rebecca entering law offices, her expression hardening as she recognized the implications. She's positioning herself to leave David while claiming maximum spousal support and potentially challenging the inheritance restructuring through divorce proceedings. She concluded, "This isn't about saving a marriage anymore. This is about protecting David from a planned financial and emotional attack." The legal strategy that Rebecca appeared to be developing was sophisticated and potentially devastating. By claiming that David's inheritance had been diminished through his mother's manipulation, she could argue for spousal support based on expected rather than actual assets. She could also claim emotional distress damages resulting from family conflict that had supposedly harmed her marriage and career prospects. Catherine had identified the attorney Rebecca was consulting as Bradley Morrison, a specialist in high-asset divorce cases who was known for aggressive tactics and maximalist financial demands. His involvement suggested that Rebecca was planning a scorched-earth approach that would attempt to extract maximum financial benefit while inflicting maximum emotional damage on David and his relationship with his mother. "Morrison doesn't take cases unless he expects to recover significant assets," Margaret observed, her extensive business network providing background knowledge about the attorney's reputation and success rate. Rebecca must have convinced him that David's family wealth makes the case worth pursuing aggressively. She's probably claiming that the inheritance restructuring was designed to defraud her of marital assets. The irony was that Rebecca's legal strategy would likely fail because the inheritance restructuring had been legitimate and legally sound. However, the litigation process could take years and cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees while generating negative publicity that would damage both Harrison Strategic Consulting and Harrison and Associates. Even unsuccessful attacks could inflict significant collateral damage. Margaret stood and walked to the window overlooking downtown Portland, her posture reflecting the weight of difficult decisions that needed to be made quickly. "We have to tell David everything," she said finally, her voice carrying resolve mixed with sadness. "Not because we want to hurt him, but because he needs complete information to protect himself from what's coming." Her decision reflected the same strategic thinking that had made her successful in crisis management throughout her career. Sometimes protecting people required sharing painful information that would allow them to make informed decisions about their future. Shielding David from Rebecca's true nature would leave him vulnerable to planned attacks that could be far more damaging than honest disclosure. "When?" I asked, recognizing that timing would be crucial for David's ability to process and respond to the information effectively. He was scheduled to meet with Margaret the following morning for their weekly business planning session, but this conversation would require considerably more time and emotional preparation than their usual professional discussions. Tonight, Margaret replied without hesitation. If Rebecca is planning to file divorce papers soon, David needs time to consult with his own attorney and prepare defensive strategies. Every day we delay gives her additional advantage in controlling the narrative and timing of the confrontation. She turned back from the window with the decisive expression that characterized her approach to business crises. I'll call him this afternoon and ask him to come for dinner. We'll tell him everything then. The conversation that evening would fundamentally alter David's understanding of his marriage, his wife, and his own judgment about relationships. It would also provide him with information necessary to protect himself from planned legal and financial attacks. The question was whether he possessed sufficient emotional resilience to absorb the truth and respond strategically rather than allowing himself to be overwhelmed by betrayal and self-doubt. Margaret gathered the investigative report and locked it in her office safe, the documents too sensitive to remain accessible to anyone who might compromise David's strategic position. Catherine should continue monitoring Rebecca's activities, she decided. If she's planning legal action, we need advance warning about timing and specific allegations. David will need every advantage we can provide. That afternoon, Margaret called David to invite him for dinner at her home, suggesting they needed to discuss some family matters that had arisen unexpectedly. Her tone was carefully neutral, avoiding alarm while conveying sufficient urgency to ensure his attendance. David agreed readily, his voice carrying the warmth that had characterized their rebuilt relationship over the past 3 months. The hours between Margaret's call and David's arrival stretched with the kind of tense anticipation that preceded difficult but necessary conversations. She prepared his favorite meal, partly from maternal instinct and partly from recognition that comfort would be important for what he was about to learn. The investigative report remained locked in her office safe, but she had prepared a summary that highlighted the most crucial findings without overwhelming detail. David arrived promptly at 7, his appearance reflecting the professional confidence he had developed during his successful management of Harrison and Associates. His greeting was affectionate but not dependent, the interaction of a son who respected his mother's expertise while maintaining his own sense of competence and authority. The transformation from the manipulated young man of 3 months earlier was remarkable and encouraging. They shared dinner with the kind of easy conversation that had become natural since their business relationship had evolved into genuine collaboration. David discussed recent client successes and challenges, seeking Margaret's insights while demonstrating his own growing expertise in strategic decision-making. The progress he had made in both personal and professional development made the coming conversation more difficult but also more necessary. After clearing the dinner dishes, Margaret led David to her study, the same room where they had conducted their business planning sessions and where she had prepared the defensive strategies that protected Harrison's strategic consulting from Rebecca's inheritance manipulation. The familiar setting provided continuity that might help him process disturbing new information in the context of their rebuilt trust and professional partnership. David, I need to share some information with you about Rebecca that will be difficult to hear but necessary for your protection. Margaret began, her tone carrying the same professional seriousness she used when briefing clients about crisis situations. I've hired a private investigator to research her background and recent activities.
What we discovered suggests that your marriage has been built on deception and manipulation from the very beginning. David's expression shifted from curiosity to concern as he absorbed the implications of his mother's words. What kind of deception? He asked, his voice steady despite the obvious tension that had entered his posture. The business training he had received over the past 3 months was apparently helping him approach personal crisis with analytical thinking rather than immediate emotional reaction. Margaret handed him the summary she had prepared, a condensed version of Catherine's findings that highlighted the most significant patterns without overwhelming detail. Rebecca has been systematically targeting wealthy men for financial advantage for at least 8 years, she explained, as he began reading. Your relationship wasn't a romantic coincidence. It was a calculated strategy that she had been planning before you ever met. David read through the summary with growing shock, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of grim recognition that suggested some unconscious awareness of inconsistencies he had never previously acknowledged. The evidence was comprehensive enough to be undeniable, but personal enough to be deeply wounding to someone who had believed he was in an authentic marriage. "The charity gala where we met," he said slowly, looking up from the documents. "She knew everything about me before we were even introduced. My interests, my background, even my favorite sailing spots." His voice carried the flat tone of someone processing fundamental betrayal. "I thought she was remarkably compatible with my interests. I was impressed by how much we had in common." Margaret nodded sympathetically, recognizing how painful it would be to reinterpret treasured memories through the lens of calculated manipulation. "Rebecca is exceptionally skilled at research and strategic relationship development," she acknowledged. "Her approach was sophisticated enough that most people would have been completely deceived. This isn't a reflection of your judgment, David. It's evidence of her expertise in manipulation." The psychological impact of discovering that his entire marriage had been based on deception was evident in David's physical reaction. His shoulders sagged slightly as he processed the implications and his hands trembled as he set down the summary document. However, his response also demonstrated the emotional resilience he had developed during his recent professional challenges and personal growth. "The inheritance demand," he said after several minutes of silence. "That was part of a larger plan to extract maximum financial benefit before ending the marriage." It was statement rather than question, his analytical mind beginning to work through the strategic implications of what he had learned. "She was already planning to leave me while positioning herself to claim spousal support based on expected rather than actual inheritance." Margaret confirmed his assessment while providing additional details about Rebecca's consultation with divorce attorneys and her apparent timeline for legal action. The evidence suggested that David had perhaps weeks rather than months before finding himself served with divorce papers that would include aggressive financial demands and possibly fraud allegations designed to maximize settlement value. "What do I do now?" David asked, his question carrying vulnerability mixed with determination. He was seeking guidance from someone whose strategic expertise he had learned to trust, but he was also demonstrating readiness to take responsibility for protecting himself rather than depending on others to solve his problems. Margaret's response reflected both her professional experience in crisis management and her maternal desire to protect her son from further harm. "First, you consult with the best divorce attorney in Portland tomorrow morning," she said firmly. "We need to get ahead of whatever legal strategy Rebecca is planning. Second, you document everything you can remember about financial irregularities or suspicious behavior that makes sense now but seemed innocent at the time." The strategic approach to handling Rebecca's planned attack would require the same methodical preparation that had protected Harrison's strategic consulting from her inheritance manipulation. David would need expert legal representation, comprehensive documentation of his wife's deceptive behavior, and emotional support systems that would help him navigate what promised to be a deliberately traumatic divorce process. "There's something else you should know," Margaret continued, opening to the section of Catherine's report that detailed Rebecca's ongoing cultivation of other potential romantic targets. "She's already been meeting with other men, developing backup relationships in case her marriage to you doesn't provide the long-term financial security she's seeking." The additional betrayal of ongoing infidelity, even if only emotional rather than physical, visibly affected David more than the financial deception had. The revelation that Rebecca had never stopped looking for better opportunities suggested that their marriage had been merely a temporary convenience rather than a meaningful commitment from her perspective. David closed his eyes briefly, processing the full scope of his wife's betrayal and manipulation. When he opened them again, his expression carried a mixture of hurt and resolve that suggested he was beginning to move from victim to strategic thinker. "I need copies of everything," he said quietly. "I need to understand exactly what she's capable of so I can protect myself appropriately." Margaret agreed to provide him with complete copies of Catherine's report while maintaining the original documentation in secure storage. The evidence would be crucial for his divorce attorney to develop effective defensive strategies and potentially pursue counterclaims if Rebecca's deceptions had created legal liability for fraud or breach of fiduciary duty. David, I want you to know that discovering this information doesn't reflect any weakness or failure on your part, Margaret said as they prepared to conclude their difficult conversation. Rebecca is a predator who has spent years perfecting manipulation techniques that would deceive most people. The fact that you were targeted doesn't say anything negative about your intelligence or judgment. Her reassurance was important for David's psychological recovery, but it was also strategically valuable. If Rebecca succeeded in undermining his confidence and self-respect, he would be less effective at protecting himself during the coming legal and emotional battle. Maintaining his recently developed sense of competence and independence would be crucial for his ability to respond effectively to planned attacks. That night, David called in sick to work and spent the day processing what he had learned while beginning preliminary preparations for protecting himself from Rebecca's planned assault. He contacted Margaret's attorney for a referral to the best divorce specialist in Portland, scheduled an emergency consultation for the following afternoon, and began documenting suspicious incidents that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now appeared to be part of systematic deception. Rebecca, meanwhile, remained unaware that her carefully maintained cover had been completely blown. She continued her normal routine of professional networking and legal consultation, apparently confident that David remained ignorant of her true nature and planned betrayal. Her false sense of security would provide strategic advantage when David finally chose to confront her or respond to her legal attacks. Catherine Walsh continued her surveillance of Rebecca's activities, providing daily updates about meetings with attorneys, financial advisors, and potential new romantic targets. The monitoring would allow David to anticipate Rebecca's timing and strategic approaches while gathering additional evidence of her deceptive behavior and calculated infidelity. The psychological impact of learning about Rebecca's systematic deception was significant, but David's response demonstrated remarkable resilience and strategic thinking. Instead of being overwhelmed by betrayal and self-doubt, he was channeling his emotions into preparation and protective action. The confidence he had developed during his business transformation was serving him well in this personal crisis. Margaret watched her son's response to the crisis with a mixture of pride and concern. He was handling the situation with maturity and strategic intelligence that exceeded her expectations, but she remained worried about the emotional toll of discovering that his entire marriage had been built on deception and manipulation. The coming weeks would test his psychological resilience in ways that business challenges hadn't prepared him for. 3 days after learning the truth about Rebecca's deception, David scheduled a meeting with his wife under the pretense of discussing their upcoming anniversary celebration. He had chosen a public restaurant for the confrontation, following his attorney's advice about creating witnesses and avoiding the possibility of false accusations about domestic violence or emotional abuse. Rebecca arrived for their lunch meeting with her usual polished appearance and practiced warmth, apparently confident that David remained ignorant of her true nature and planned betrayal. Her performance was flawless as always, the kind of sophisticated emotional manipulation that had successfully deceived multiple victims over the years. David waited until after they had ordered their meals before placing a folder on the table between them. "Rebecca, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about our marriage and your plans for our future together," he said calmly, his tone carrying none of the emotional distress she might have expected from someone who had just discovered systematic betrayal and manipulation. Rebecca's expression shifted slightly as she recognized the folder contained documents, though she maintained her composed facade while attempting to assess the situation. "What kind of plans?" she asked carefully, her voice carrying cautious curiosity rather than alarm. She was apparently confident that whatever David had discovered couldn't be comprehensive enough to threaten her strategic position. David opened the folder to reveal photographs from Catherine's surveillance, financial records documenting Rebecca's secret accounts, and summaries of her meetings with divorce attorneys. "I'm talking about your plans to divorce me while claiming spousal support based on inheritance expectations that were deliberately manipulated by my mother," he said quietly. "I'm talking about the 8-year pattern of targeting wealthy men for financial advantage that preceded our marriage." The confrontation that Rebecca had been planning to control through careful timing and legal strategy was happening on David's terms instead of hers. The evidence he presented was comprehensive enough to demonstrate that her deception had been completely exposed, eliminating any possibility of continuing her manipulation through false narratives or emotional appeals. Rebecca's carefully maintained mask finally slipped as she realized the full scope of what David knew about her background and recent activities. Her expression shifted from confident charm to defensive calculation as she rapidly assessed her options for damage control or strategic retreat. "David, I can explain everything," she began, her voice carrying the kind of practiced sincerity that had served her well in previous confrontations with deceived victims. However, her explanation would need to account for years of systematic deception and ongoing betrayal that were documented with photographic evidence and financial records. David's response demonstrated how much he had grown in strategic thinking and emotional resilience over the past 3 months. Instead of allowing Rebecca to control the conversation through manipulation and false explanations, he maintained focus on the documented evidence while avoiding the emotional reactions that might provide her with opportunities for further deception. The reckoning that Margaret had anticipated was finally beginning, with David armed with complete information about his wife's true nature and Rebecca suddenly forced to confront the consequences of her calculated betrayal. The strategic intelligence that had protected Harrison's strategic consulting was now being applied to protect David from the planned emotional and financial assault that Rebecca had been preparing in secret. The next phase of their confrontation would determine whether Rebecca would attempt continued manipulation or finally acknowledge the sophisticated deception that had defined their entire relationship. Either way, David was no longer vulnerable to the calculated charm and false emotions that had originally made him an ideal target for her predatory relationship strategy. Rebecca's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely as she stared at the evidence spread across our restaurant table. The photographs, financial records, and attorney consultation summaries painted an undeniable portrait of systematic deception that spanned years before our marriage had even begun. Her confident smile disappeared, replaced by the calculating expression I now recognized as her authentic personality beneath the practiced charm. "How long have you known?" she asked, finally, abandoning any pretense of innocence or explanation. The woman who had spent 5 years manipulating me through false emotions and strategic vulnerability was suddenly speaking with cold directness that revealed her true nature more clearly than any investigation could have documented. 3 days, I replied honestly, watching her process the implications of my timeline. She was probably wondering whether I had confronted her immediately upon learning the truth, or whether I had spent time preparing strategic responses to her planned attacks. The uncertainty was clearly uncomfortable for someone accustomed to controlling information and timing in her relationships. Rebecca's eyes moved quickly across the documents, her business training helping her assess the legal implications of what I had discovered. "The surveillance was thorough," she observed with professional detachment. "Your mother hired someone competent." Her tone carried grudging respect for the investigation's quality rather than anger about the invasion of her privacy. I nodded toward the photographs showing her meetings with divorce attorneys and potential new romantic targets. "Catherine Walsh specializes in corporate fraud investigation. She approached your deception like a business case rather than a personal matter." The professional approach had been necessary to uncover the full scope of Rebecca's systematic manipulation without emotional interference clouding the analysis. Rebecca asked, her voice carrying the kind of business-like directness that suggested she was ready to negotiate rather than continuing to maintain false pretenses. She had apparently concluded that ongoing deception was no longer viable given the comprehensive nature of the evidence against her. The question surprised me with its straightforward acknowledgement that our marriage was essentially a business transaction that had been exposed and required resolution. "I want you to withdraw any divorce filings you've prepared, close the secret accounts you've been funding with our joint resources, and leave Portland quietly." I replied in exchange, "I won't pursue fraud charges or share this information with your current employer." Rebecca considered my proposal with the same analytical attention she had probably applied to targeting me originally. She was calculating risks and benefits, assessing whether accepting my terms would be more advantageous than attempting to salvage some financial benefit through aggressive legal action. Her silence suggested the negotiation was more complex than simple capitulation. The spousal support I could claim would exceed what I've taken from joint accounts, she said finally, testing whether I understood the legal realities of divorce settlements in Oregon.
Even with evidence of deception, I have legitimate claims to marital assets and ongoing financial support. Her assessment was probably accurate from a purely legal perspective. I smiled slightly, recognizing that she was still trying to maintain some strategic advantage even after being completely exposed. Bradley Morrison might disagree once he learns about the fraud investigation and the criminal liability you'd face for identity theft and financial deception, I replied calmly. Catherine documented everything, Rebecca. Your pattern with previous relationships, the social engineering attempts on my financial advisors, even the false employment references you used when we first met. The mention of criminal liability visibly affected her confidence for the first time during our conversation. She had probably assumed that her deceptions fell into civil rather than criminal categories, that the worst consequences would be financial rather than potentially involving prosecution and imprisonment. The broader scope of legal exposure was clearly something she hadn't anticipated. What about the accounts I've established? She asked, apparently focusing on practical arrangements rather than attempting further manipulation or emotional appeals. Her business-like approach to concluding our relationship was almost refreshing after years of calculated charm and false intimacy. Keep whatever you've already transferred, I replied, having consulted with my attorney about the most efficient resolution strategy. Consider it severance payment for 5 years of performance art. But nothing additional, and no claims against family assets or business holdings. The financial loss was acceptable given the alternative of prolonged litigation and continued manipulation attempts. Rebecca nodded slowly, apparently concluding that my terms represented the best available outcome given her completely compromised position. I'll need 2 weeks to arrange alternative employment and housing, she said, her tone purely transactional. After that I'll relocate to another city and will have no further contact. 1 week, I countered, recognizing that extended timelines would provide opportunities for her to attempt additional manipulation or extraction schemes. Catherine will continue monitoring your activities until you leave Portland. Any attempts to contact my family, access additional funds or interfere with our businesses will void this agreement and result in immediate legal action. She agreed to the accelerated timeline without argument, probably recognizing that her strategic position was untenable regardless of timing considerations. The woman who had spent 5 years presenting herself as my devoted wife was concluding our marriage with the same calculated efficiency she had probably applied to ending her previous relationships when they no longer served her financial interests. We divided the remaining practical arrangements with business-like efficiency that felt surreal after years of what I had believed was emotional intimacy. Rebecca would take her personal belongings and the vehicle registered in her name, while leaving everything else to avoid complications about marital asset division. She would also provide written confirmation that she had no claims against Harrison and Associates, Harrison Strategic Consulting, or any Harrington family assets. For what it's worth, David, you're a good man, Rebecca said as we prepared to leave the restaurant. In different circumstances, if I had been capable of authentic emotion, I might have actually loved you. Her comment was probably the first completely honest statement she had made during our entire relationship. I studied her face carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or false sentiment, but her expression seemed genuinely reflective rather than strategically calculated. I hope you find whatever you're actually looking for, Rebecca, I replied. But I hope you find it through building something rather than taking from others. She smiled slightly at my response, though whether from amusement or recognition was unclear. Maybe someday, she said simply, gathering her purse and the copies of documents I had allowed her to keep. Maybe someday I'll try building instead of extraction. It was the closest thing to remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing she had offered. After Rebecca left the restaurant, I remained at our table for several minutes, processing the end of what I had believed was the most important relationship of my adult life. The woman I had loved for 5 years had never actually existed. She had been a carefully constructed performance designed to extract financial and social advantages from my family connections and inherited resources.
The emotional impact was significant, but surprisingly manageable. The confidence I had developed during my business transformation over the past 3 months had apparently strengthened my ability to handle personal crisis as well as professional challenges. Instead of being devastated by betrayal, I felt a strange sense of relief at finally understanding the disconnection I had sensed but never acknowledged during our marriage. That evening, I called Margaret to inform her that Rebecca had agreed to leave Portland quietly in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution and public exposure. My mother's response was characteristically practical, focusing on ensuring that all legal protections remained in place, while allowing Rebecca to withdraw without creating additional complications for our family or businesses. "How are you handling this emotionally?" Margaret asked, her tone carrying genuine maternal concern rather than professional interest. She had been worried that discovering the full scope of Rebecca's deception would undermine the confidence and independence I had developed during my recent personal growth. "Better than I expected," I admitted honestly. Learning the truth was painful, but it also explained inconsistencies that I had never understood about our relationship. In some ways, it's a relief to finally understand why I always felt like I was performing rather than simply being myself with her. The recognition that my discomfort had been intuitive awareness of deception was actually encouraging for my confidence in future relationship decisions. Margaret's satisfaction with my response was evident in her voice. "You've handled this entire situation with remarkable maturity and strategic thinking," she observed. "Both the business challenges and now this personal crisis. I'm proud of the man you've become, David, particularly how you've grown through adversity rather than being diminished by it." Her praise meant more to me than she probably realized. After years of feeling like I was disappointing everyone's expectations, after months of recognizing how thoroughly I had been manipulated and deceived, having my mother acknowledge genuine growth and capability was profoundly validating. The confidence wasn't inherited or granted. It was earned through navigating real challenges successfully. Rebecca kept her word about leaving Portland quietly and efficiently. Within a week, she had relocated to Seattle with a position at a consulting firm that apparently hadn't conducted thorough background research about her employment history or personal references. Catherine Walsh confirmed her departure and reported no attempts to contact my family or interfere with our business operations. 6 months later, I received an unexpected letter from Rebecca, postmarked from Denver, where she had apparently relocated again. The brief note informed me that she had entered therapy to address what she described as relationship addiction and emotional unavailability. She thanked me for handling our separation with dignity, rather than vindictiveness, and she hoped that my kindness might contribute to her eventual recovery. I never responded to her letter, but I found myself hoping that her claim about seeking therapy was genuine rather than another manipulation attempt. The woman who had systematically deceived me for 5 years deserved the opportunity to become someone capable of authentic connection, even if we would never interact again. Everyone deserved the chance to grow beyond their worst behaviors if they were willing to do the difficult work of change. Margaret and I continued our weekly business planning meetings, which evolved into broader discussions about life, relationships, and the sometimes painful process of learning to trust our own judgment after being systematically deceived. Her guidance had been instrumental in helping me navigate both business challenges and personal crisis with strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. Harrison and Associates thrived under my independent management, eventually expanding into 3 new service areas and acquiring several small competitors whose founders were ready to retire. The company that Rebecca had expected to claim through manipulation had grown beyond its original scope under leadership that emphasized authentic value creation rather than inherited advantage. My relationship with Margaret reached a level of mutual respect and genuine affection that had been impossible when I was seeking her approval rather than earning her recognition. We worked together as professional equals while maintaining the emotional connection that had been damaged but not destroyed by years of family conflict and external manipulation. 2 years after Rebecca's departure, I met Sarah Chen at a business conference in San Francisco. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, without the calculated intensity that I now recognized had characterized my courtship with Rebecca. Sarah was a successful architect who had built her own firm through competence and dedication, someone who approached relationships as opportunities for mutual growth rather than strategic advantage. The contrast between authentic emotional connection and sophisticated manipulation became clear as Sarah and I built trust through shared experiences and honest communication rather than through research and performance. Learning to recognize genuine compatibility as opposed to calculated charm was one of the most valuable skills I developed during my recovery from Rebecca's systematic deception. Margaret and Sarah developed a warm friendship based on mutual respect and shared values about building rather than extracting, creating rather than manipulating. Watching them interact, I could see clearly how different authentic relationships were from the strategic performances that had characterized my marriage to Rebecca. The ease and honesty were refreshing after years of unconsciously navigating emotional manipulation. When Sarah and I married 3 years after Rebecca's departure, the ceremony was small and focused on celebration rather than display. Margaret served as my best man, symbolizing how our relationship had evolved from family obligation to chosen partnership based on shared values and genuine affection. The wedding represented authentic commitment rather than strategic alliance. Rebecca's attempt to destroy what she thought I was signing had ultimately created opportunities for growth that never would have existed without the crisis she precipitated. Her manipulation had forced me to develop genuine business capabilities, authentic self-confidence, and the ability to recognize healthy relationships as distinct from predatory ones. Sometimes destruction does create space for better construction. Looking back, I realized that Margaret had been right about my not knowing what I was signing when I demanded early inheritance. I had thought I was claiming financial advantage and business control. What I actually signed was permission for my mother to force me to grow beyond dependence and entitlement into someone capable of earning rather than simply receiving success. The inheritance I eventually received was far more valuable than the 40% ownership I had originally demanded. It included business expertise, strategic thinking capabilities, emotional resilience, and the ability to build authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation or calculation. These were assets that couldn't be stolen, manipulated, or transferred through legal documents. Margaret continued managing Harrison Strategic Consulting with the same excellence that had made her legendary in Portland's business community. However, she also began developing succession plans that emphasized earned transition rather than automatic inheritance, ensuring that her life's work would be protected by competent leadership regardless of family relationships or genetic connections. Catherine Walsh became a trusted advisor for both our companies, helping to screen potential employees and business partners for integrity and authentic capabilities. Her expertise in recognizing deception and manipulation proved valuable for protecting against future attempts at exploitation by people who viewed successful businesses as targets for extraction rather than contribution. Rebecca never contacted me again after her single letter from Denver. Catherine's occasional monitoring of public records suggested that she had continued moving between cities and relationships, though whether she had genuinely pursued therapy and personal growth remained unknown. I hoped for her sake that she had found ways to build authentic success rather than continuing to extract advantages from others. The experience taught me that sometimes the most important signature you provide isn't on legal documents, but on permission slips that allow yourself and others to become who they're capable of being when freed from manipulation, false expectations, and strategic relationships that prioritize advantage over authenticity. Margaret had been absolutely right about my not knowing what I was signing. But she had also been right about knowing exactly what needed to be destroyed to make room for something better. Sometimes the most profound gift you can give someone is the crisis that forces them to discover their own strength, competence, and capacity for genuine connection with others. The story that began with Rebecca's confident assertion that I didn't know what I was signing concluded with all of us understanding exactly what had been destroyed and what had been created in its place. Manipulation had been replaced by authentic relationship. Entitlement had been replaced by earned achievement. Strategic extraction had been replaced by genuine value creation. The transformation had been painful but ultimately invaluable for everyone involved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.